Hello, my name is Zelda Abramson.
And I'm John Lynch.
And we are the authors of the Montreal Shtetl, Making Home After the Holocaust.
At the end of World War II, there were over 11 million displaced persons in Europe. A year later, there were still 1 million DPs, including 250,000 Jews who couldn't safely or sanely return home. These people desperately needed resettlement. A number of European Jews wanted to go to Palestine, a lot to the US. The US had its immigration quota system set up in 1924 with yearly caps from each country. 65,000 from the UK, 29,000 from Germany, 6,000 from Italy. For the Jews in Poland and Hungary, countries where millions of Jews had been killed during the war, the quota was 6,500 from Poland, 800 from Hungary. This included all citizens, not just Jews. Canada, like the United States, were on the international stage sympathetic to the plight of the DPs, but in their local constituencies were against actually having folks come in, especially Jews. From the early 1930s, the Canadian border had been essentially closed to immigration. And when it finally opened in 1947, unlike the US quota system, they just focused on the local country's labor needs. At that time, the Canadian Jewish community and the clothing and textile manufacturers in Toronto and Montreal convinced the government to let them develop a labor scheme to bring in workers for the shmata trade. In December 1947, this is when the first Jewish refugees and their families came to Canada.
Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. They arrived in Montreal in 1952. My parents rebuilt their life in what we call the Montreal Shtetl. The majority of survivors who came to Canada settled in Montreal. Approximately, there were 40,000 between 1947 and 1954. So why this book? Not long before my mother died in 2005, I asked her, who helped us when we first came to Montreal? Oddly, a question I never thought of before. She said, no one, we helped each other. I asked for help once and was refused. This was the only time I ever asked for help from any agency, and I swore I would never do so again. When I questioned why, she answered, no one really cared. Fast forward 3 years, 2008, the New York Times featured a story based on records of Jewish social service agencies that served the post-war survivors living in New York City. The author claimed that many of these refugees walked a gauntlet of resistance and distrust. They were viewed at worst as human debris, at best as unfortunate victims who have to be re-socialized. Today, the story of the Holocaust is memorialized worldwide. It is part of the collective identity of all Jews. Yet, the article in the New York Times and my mother's story stand in contrast to the common perception that the Jewish community, locally and globally, rallied around the Holocaust survivors. Over the next few years, I wondered a lot about this. What do we know about the strategies survivors used to facilitate their integration into Montreal and Canadian society? What were the factors in play that enabled integration? And when did the attitudes of world Jewry change towards the Holocaust? So the research process began. After 5 years of interviews, there were 67, and extensive archival research, the book was completed in 2018. The Montreal Shtetl is written as a series of narratives constructed from the interviews we did with the survivors. The book is organized into 3 parts. In part one, Uprooting, the narratives focus on the survivors' lives before, during, and after the war years, culminating in their arrival in Montreal. It addresses the chaos of Europe the years after the war and the differing ways the survivors came to Montreal. Malia Rogers will share Simca's story during and after the war in Europe.
I was saved only because my mother saved me, and she saved me only because she was a midwife. That was the golden ticket. She couldn't have chosen a better profession. I was born in Vilna, Poland. The same city today is known as Vilnius, Lithuania. I lived about 100 kilometers from Vilna, which is now in Belarus. I had a wonderful childhood. I have wonderful memories of that time. I was an only child, and I was 6 when the war broke out. For the first 2 weeks, it was quiet. There was no news. We didn't know what was happening. There was nothing. After 2 weeks, on September 17th, 1939, the Soviets came in from the east. Our town was in the eastern side of Poland, which is now in Belarus, and not far from Vilna. What, of course, I didn't know, but learned later, is that in those 2 weeks, Poland surrendered. Poland was split by a pre-invasion arrangement between Germany and the Soviet Union. Western Poland was under German occupation and Eastern Poland under Soviet occupation. We were in the eastern part, what we then thought was the good side of Poland. And the Jews from the areas that were under Germany started running away. Where were they running? East. A year later, June 22nd, 1941, the war broke out, at least for us, again. There was the sudden bombing, and Germany occupied sections of what had been the Soviet-controlled part of the country. You know, we wanted to run. The trend was, when they come, you run. But this war was different because they landed everywhere at the same time. There was really no running away, yet everybody was running. The Germans started rounding up children to save them, they said. I heard about this later. They rounded up 300 children and put them on a train. They told me not to go. And when they came looking for children, I didn't go. The transport of 300 children was bombed. It wiped out whoever was on that train. There were so many instances of nearly escaping death, but in between, there was life. During the war, the Germans cordoned off a neighborhood for Jews only and started bringing in Jews from all the farms and smaller villages. Right away, multiple families were forced to share a house and wear a gelalata, the Jewish badge. This new neighborhood, enclosed by barbed wire, became our ghetto. My mother got permission to leave the city should someone come and pick her up to help with the delivery of babies, especially babies of non-Jewish women. She was issued a pass called Nützlicher Jude, useful Jew. This pass was very good. She had contact with a lot of people in the immediate area and outlying area of this town. When the ghetto was being liquidated in December 1942, my mother and I escaped. That was the last time I saw my father. My mother knew women. Because she caught their babies, there's an intimate kind of relationship. They might help, she believed. We went to the houses that she knew who lived there, and they would say, no, but just wait a minute. And they would go and they would bring some bread for us. Some would say, you can stay here for the day. We walked by night. The fantasy was that we were going to find the partisans, but the partisans were very well hidden and we never found them. We eventually came to a family who was very poor. They were farmers with the least amount of whatever farmers can have. They were simple folk, like Christian goodness. We would be in the barn during the day, and at night they would bring us in, not every night, but from time to time, and we would sit next to the oven to warm up. They shared the little that they had. And of course, they were very scared that other people would find out that we were hiding in their home. We believed this was not known until one day a man came and he said to the farmer, "Give me the midwife." This man was a Polish army officer and he was used to being obeyed. The woman said, "Oh, she's not here. She's here and you're giving her to me." He was very upset and very insistent. She answered, No, she was here. I'll tell you the truth. She was here, but about 3 weeks ago, she went away. She just went away. I don't know where she is." He took out a revolver and he said, "If you don't give me the woman, I'm going to kill you." At that point, we were hiding behind the oven. So my mother came from behind the oven and she said, "Okay, I'm here. What's the matter?" "The wife is having a miscarriage and she's bleeding terribly. You have to come." "Okay, I'll come, but I have my little girl here." Oh no. I have 3 children. I don't need more children. A Jewish child? I'm not taking a Jewish child. You just come. My mother insisted. "If I can't take her, I'm not going." "You're going. I have a gun." "So shoot me," she said. "I'm not going to come out of this war alive. Somebody's going to shoot me. You want to shoot me? You can shoot me." So he agreed, and I became the schlep-along kid, the kid who was always dragged along. I was with her constantly, and she didn't go anywhere without me. We came to the house. This woman was lying there. Even I, who was 10 years old, knew this woman was dying. She was white, and underneath the bed there was like a wooden basin, and the blood was going into the basin through the mattress. She was just finished. And he said to my mother, "If you save my wife's life, I'm going to save your life." And my mother saved the woman's life. I don't know what she did. She stopped the bleeding, and he kept his word and hid us. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet army pushed back the German army and took over Poland. At a certain point, they let people go to Poland. We left and we went to Lodz, which was one of the centers the Jews migrated to after the war. This was 1945, and I was 12. In Lodz, a lot of Jews were traveling around on the trains, even on top of the trains, looking for family. And a lot of people were getting married, appropriately or not, very quickly. It was often their second marriage. They did not know each other well and did not know what happened to their husband or wife. My mother got married in Lodz. He was from the western side of Poland. He had been married before and had a little child whom he never saw. My parents wanted to go to Palestine. That seemed to be the only place left to go. In order to get to Palestine, you had to get to Italy. And in order to get to Italy, you had to go through Austria. So we went to Austria. We got off the train in Czechoslovakia near Bratislava. As we were crossing the border illegally, our goal was to find a place to walk across the border. When we finally reached Vienna, I was very disappointed that the Danube wasn't blue. It was a little greenish with green stuff floating on top. My mother applied to be a nurse in Bad Gastein, which was once an upscale resort and now to be a displaced person camp and hospital, and they took her. At Bad Gastein, the 3 of us had 1 room. We could no longer go to Palestine because my mother became pregnant and she couldn't make the journey to Italy, where we were to embark a ship and illegally go to Palestine, as there was a lot of walking up the Alps and down the Alps to go to Italy. There was a Canadian commission at the time that looked for skilled workers. There was a tailor scheme. And though my father wasn't a tailor, but for the scheme, he was a tailor. First, he needed to prove that he was a tailor. there was this test that they gave to tailors, hand sewing a buttonhole. Everyone knew the test. When the Canadian representatives came to Bad Gastein, he stayed up all night learning how to properly hand sew a buttonhole. He passed the test, and he came to Canada as a tailor. This was 1948, and I was 15.
The narratives in part 2, Unpacking, reflect the dailiness of rebuilding lives, addressing such issues as housing, work, paid and unpaid, education, and language. Judy Gold will read Henya's story.
I was born in Warsaw, Poland on March 28, 1924. My parents were modern people and highly cultured. 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto. I was among the few last ones to be deported from the ghetto. This was the beginning of June 1943. Then, Majdanek, Birkenau, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. We were a group of friends who survived the camps. We stuck together. I wanted to go to the United States because I had an uncle and cousins living there. So we moved to the American zone to a city called Fulda. I registered myself with the American consul, but I was not hopeful. We were considered Polish citizens and there were quotas. The Americans allowed in 5,000 Poles a year, and the Poles who were non-Jews had priority. In Fulda, I met my future husband. He was the younger brother of my best friend from Auschwitz. It is now 1947, then 1948, and we are still in Germany. Our problem became how to get out of Germany. We wanted to get married, but we didn't see a way. There was an opportunity, he thought, for him to come to Canada as a child, an orphan. He was too old, though. So he paid the German officers, changed his name, changed the date of birth, and went ahead. This is my story of how I came to Canada. I was waiting and waiting. It was later in 1948. I heard that the Canadian government was looking for domestics. That's great. This may be my only opportunity. I'm going to come over as a domestic. I don't even know how to peel a potato. We knew about the US, but knew nothing about Canada, only that Canada and the United States are neighbors. Once we get to Canada, I will just cross the border, I thought. I met with the Canadian immigration people and I registered to go as a domestic. I arrived in Montreal just before Christmas 1948, and it was rush, rush, rush. They sent me right away to a Jewish family. I was supposed to go to an elderly couple's home. There was a duplex. They lived upstairs, and their daughter, who had 3 children, lived downstairs. I was sent downstairs to be a domestic for the daughter. That was not legal, as they weren't part of the original contract program. I didn't know what to do. I can't begin to tell you. I was so used to the concentration camps, to the Germans, that I was afraid to speak up. And what did I know about anything? I said to myself, it doesn't matter. As soon as I can, I'll go to my family in the States, which is where I wanted to be in the first place. I found out later that the family who hired me as a domestic had to sign a contract with the government that they would give me my own room. I would receive $30 per month and I would get half a day Thursday and all day Sunday off. I walk into their house, they show me a room. I did not have my own room, but had to share a room with their daughter. I never asked for anything. I didn't ask for special food and I couldn't eat what they gave me. I had gained a lot of weight after the war, but while here, I began to lose and lose weight. I lost a total of 30 pounds. The work itself was not that difficult. A bit of helping with meals, cleaning up after meals, and lots of babysitting days and evenings. I had to be available all the time. I only got to see my future husband on Sundays, and the friends I met on the boat I hardly ever saw. After 10 months, I couldn't take it anymore. I have to get out of here. I don't feel free. I want to be free. I want to be with my friends, and I don't care what I'm going to do to make a living, but I want to get out. Don't forget what I missed. I missed the years from 1939 to 1949, 10 years, my entire youth. I didn't have an education. I didn't have anything. I just wanted to learn to live and to learn to trust. So where do I look for a job? Somebody gave me a name of a factory downtown that makes suits. I walked in, went in, and got the job. I learned to sew buttons on suit jackets. I was making maybe $25 a week. This was the end of 1949. My future husband arrived in Canada and was working in a sportswear factory, earning almost nothing. At this time, I didn't want to marry because I thought that with the little money he makes and the little money I make, I will always have to work in a factory. I'm not going to better myself. I said, no way. But we live very close to each other. Then my aunt and uncle who were living in the United States died, and I received a small inheritance, and we decided the time was right to get married. This was 1951. When we married, I moved to his room because there was a kitchen I could use. We rented the room from two old Jewish people. She belonged to Hadassah. She was terrible to us. I wasn't allowed to keep a pot or a plate in the kitchen. She would always watch over me. When I cooked, and she would see how I peeled a potato, she had to get out of the kitchen. She couldn't stand it. She would charge me extra for anything she could. I put a little bit more water in the soup. I had to pay extra to cover the cost of water. I got pregnant right away and we soon moved. Why? Because when she learned I was pregnant, she almost threw us out. She didn't want a child in the house, a baby in her house. I found a room with a widow, Mrs. Katz. She rented us her bedroom, which was very big, and she moved into the double parlor. This was my daughter's first home. A couple of years later, Mrs. Katz moved out and we took over the whole flat. My daughter was born in 1952 and I stopped working. Now, with me not working, we could not afford to pay for the whole flat. We moved to the double parlor and I rented my bedroom. I gave birth at the hospital. At that time, breastfeeding was not supported. They would teach how to give a bottle, but not much else. After 8 days, I come home and I take the baby out on the bed. I show her to Mrs. Katz and she said, "The baby is a little nothing." She wasn't critical, but only commenting on the baby's weight, 6 pounds, 6 ounces. I look at my baby, I look at Mrs. Katz, and I start crying. She said, "Don't be afraid, she won't break." She started to teach me how to diaper the baby, and I learned, of course, right away. What did I know about a baby? I didn't know a thing. I used to feed her like we did at home in Poland. I used to push her to eat, and she would throw up. I was so nervous about the bottles. I never let her drink from them if I didn't boil the water and rinse the bottle at least 20 times. I felt so stupid all the time. When did I touch a baby, you understand? I had nobody to teach me anything, to tell me anything. Now we have television, radio, we have books, the internet. We had to learn everything by ourselves. But we had each other, the survivors. We used to meet, we would understand each other. We lived through the same experiences in Europe. And in Montreal, we started over together. I never asked for anything. My husband never asked for anything. We survived the camps. We came here with nothing. My husband brought a little suitcase, which he still has, and he had in his pocket 10, maybe $15. I didn't even have this. We didn't ask for anything. We didn't even know that you can ask anybody. When we came here, we never looked back. He started working right away, and I was working right away. We lived on what we had, and those were happy days. We had a baby.
Making Home, Part 3 of the Montreal Shtetl, is an exploration of the non-material aspects of settling and addresses questions of identity, integration, assimilation, regional politics, and belonging. We present two narratives that address issues of integration and assimilation. First, there is Estelle and Irving, who were Canadian teenagers who witnessed the arrival of the survivors in their neighborhood. Their narrative will be read by Margot Dionne and Robbie O'Neill.
Irving and I were born in Montreal, I in 1932, he in 1931. I first became aware of the war when I was about 7 or 8 years old. That was about the beginning of 1940. I would see people hanging around a radio, a little black radio in the kitchen, listening to the news. I knew there was a war on and it was serious, but I was not aware of what was happening to the Jews. Absolutely not.
My experience and understanding of the war was vastly different from Estelle's. You see, my father was political. This was an important part of his life. Talk about the war was very common around the supper table. And I had a huge map in my room pinned up on my wall. My father would follow the progress or the retreat of the Allies. It was a very immediate experience, and I certainly knew that something was happening to the Jewish population. It really came home to me, though, one day. I was on the street playing with my friends who were mostly Jewish, but a couple of them were English kids, and some, well, they were brought up in very anti-Semitic surroundings. I remember this one kid distinctly saying to me with a gleeful smile on his face, "You guys better watch out if the Germans win the war, they're gonna get you." And I was conscious of the fact that anti-Semitism was very real. And I was conscious of the fact that something was going on in Europe that was terrible, that people were getting killed. But in our house, we'd talk about the Jews being persecuted, but specifics such as knowledge of concentration camps, gas chambers, probably not. That only came out afterwards when the war was over.
We had no known family in Europe, or so we originally thought. I don't know what year it was. I was probably 15 or 16, so it must have been around 1948 that my father's family, my father had some very wealthy sisters here, were notified that some relative had survived. I don't know how they got this notification, maybe through the Red Cross. The family had a little meeting together and said, "What do we do?" They decided to ignore it because they said that these people will rob you blind. It was pretty horrific. And after that, there was no more talk about it. I have no idea who that person was and what happened to them.
Well, my father's family was geographically divided. He had his father and siblings living in Hungary. During the war, you couldn't write, you couldn't phone, there was no contact. So we knew nothing about their fate until a couple of months after the war. We got this long distance call, the operator asking, "Are we talking to Nick Smith?" And Nick was my father's name. It was a call from the Red Cross saying that they knew a person who claims to be the brother of Nick Smith. Then they explained that my father's brother had survived the war. He was found in a concentration camp. He was liberated, terrible shape, and was taken in by the Swedish government. Well, there was jubilation in the family that somebody survived. He was the only survivor. But several weeks later, after a phone call, there was a letter containing my uncle's picture. He was wearing pajamas and he seemed to be in some kind of garden that could have been attached to a hospital. It looked sort of nice, but God, he looked cadaverous, thin, terrible. And following that, a couple of more months passed and we got another postcard or a letter from the Red Cross letting us know that he died from consumption, tuberculosis.
I remember when the immigrants started moving into the neighborhood. It was 1937, 1947, and I was just a few blocks down from where Irving lived. If you were to ask, were we friendly to the immigrants? I have to say no. I remember next door there was a family, a husband, a woman maybe in her 30s, and they had a child. My memory of her is running behind this child, carrying a banana, saying, "S, S, S, eat, eat, eat." I can't remember any Canadian mothers on the street being welcoming to her. Through my teenage years, these were strange people. They didn't speak English. They ran after their kids with a banana. They just didn't fit in. I recently asked Irving if he remembers any people our age, teenagers, coming to our school. Where were these teenagers? We both don't remember any survivor children in our high school class. I graduated in 1950 and Irving graduated in 1949. There might have been some in the following years. There was a missing generation. There were, however, some young people, older than we were, maybe in their 20s, we became aware of, and we did not like them. They did not dress the way we did. They had their own style. They wore their coats over their shoulders, which we thought was really creepy. They wore their fedoras differently than our fathers or brothers wore their fedoras. Most certainly, as teenage females, we would not go out with these guys. First of all, they were considerably older than we were, but even thinking about our older sisters, those of us who had them, they would not date the displaced persons, the DPs, as we called them, unless you had a feeling of desperation, that you could not meet someone amongst your own group of people, people who were from here. We had a name for them. It was derogatory and demeaning. We called them Mockies. Mocky means they were different. They didn't speak English. And if they did, they eventually spoke with terrible accents. They were different. Is this your memory, Irving?
Unfortunately, this is what makes the world go round and round. We Jews are not free of it, so yes. The immigrants who came across were referred to as Mockies. And if not Mockies, they were called maybe slightly more polite greeners. The inference was a green, unripe fruit. My first impression of the immigrants was confusion. As I said, my father was political, and we talked constantly about the war, what was happening, and what the world would look like afterwards. When I first encountered these people, I felt that we had an obligation to them, that they had suffered terribly. And yet amongst my friends, there's Jewish families and Jewish kids, there was a decided hostility towards them, and I guess I was affected by my peers. So I too used the same words, probably not greeners, DPs possibly, most certainly Mocky. I have a distinct memory of what happened outside the YMHA. There was a terrible fight between these young immigrants, the DPs and the good Jewish Canadian kids who were 17, 18, 19 years of age. One reason was the Canadian boys didn't want these people dating our Jewish girls. Now, I was younger. I was like 14, not exactly in the dating age yet, but I was aware of the animosity that existed. When I look back at it, it was just terrible.
It was only many years later, we were grown up and we really discovered what the Holocaust was about, that it struck me that the reason why we disliked these new immigrants is that we were assimilating. We were now second and third generation Canadians. We all spoke English fluently, sometimes with a Yiddish drawl. We were actually becoming lawyers and doctors and what have you. Suddenly, there is this wave of people who don't speak English and who are somewhat different. I think that many of us were frightened of this. It would have to affect us in some manner.
Well, we all knew what anti-Semitism was for the very simple reason we lived through it. McGill University had a distinct numerus clausus. So many Jews for engineering, so many Jews accepted in medicine, very, very select number. This was real. It's factual. In the Laurentians, without exaggeration, the Laurentians were festooned with signs like, no Jews, restricted. We all knew what restricted meant. Everyone knew the language. It meant you, Jews, are not wanted.
For us, Jewish Canadians, it was a fight to win recognition and equality with other groups, and we were registering certain victories. When these Eastern European Jews came into Canada without the language and different sorts of behaviors, we were worried about being labeled. We, who were actually breaking into Canadian society, were extremely worried that we would be tarred now with the brush of anti-Semitism once again because of our brethren who somehow survived the war, came to Canada and made us feel uncomfortable. So we had a total lack of sympathy. This contempt for a group of people who endured God knows what.
And one other thing, which has become well known today, is when the DPs attempted to explain what they experienced, a lot of the reaction here was, well, if you survived, you must have done something terrible. They didn't find understanding. They didn't find empathy. This is suggested as being one of the reasons why a lot of immigrants chose not to talk about it. They just stopped talking about it. I mean, how can you talk to someone about the loss of your family when they respond, if you survived, you must have did something terrible. You must have been a capo. I think it's important for us to talk about this now, but we did not like doing it. It brings back some terrible memories we're not very proud of.
The final reading will be done by Ami Trefler, who will present Teresa. Teresa's narrative captures the process of assimilation.
She's on mute.
Ami, you're on mute.
I still met him after the war. Okay. I met my husband Nathan after the war in Lodz, Poland. His brother Misha survived, as did his cousin Nathan. We all lived together. Misha comes home one day in 1947 from the Jewish Committee. The Jewish Committee had a registration office for people looking for people. They had a book of names organized alphabetically. People from overseas would contact the office looking for relatives. We would often go to the Jewish Committee to see if there were any familiar names in the book. It was also a place where people would hope they would run into somebody they knew. I was always hoping that my little sister would show up, but in the end, it was only a hope. And on that day, Misha came home and told us that cousins living in Montreal posted a notice for him and the Nathans. Of course, Misha got in touch and they started writing to one another. They said, if we want to come to Canada, they would gladly be a sponsor. And that's what happened. The immigration process began. The Canadian relatives arranged 4 visas for us as workers on a farm here in Montreal. Imagine me, a Jewish farmer. When we arrived in Canada, we did not go straight to Montreal, but went right away to our cousin's summer cottage in Saint-Agathe. It was a week before Labor Day, and we spent the week there. They received us very warmly. They were cooking and inviting us for special dinners. I had my first sweet corn. I had leg of lamb. It's true, they wanted to receive us as well as possible, but there was nothing I could talk to them about. One cousin was a bit younger than I was. I remember I brought from Poland a 2-piece bathing suit. They looked at me like I was crazy. Who's wearing a 2-piece bathing suit? They had no political interest, no interest in the arts and culture. They seemed very provincial, small-minded. I was born in a very big city. It was for me such a terribly alien atmosphere. We arrived in Montreal after Labor Day on the hottest day. It must have been 100 degrees. And the humidity of this I've never seen. That was a greater shock than the culture shock I felt from the Laurentians. I guess everything was a culture shock. My first impression of Montreal, it was so strange. It was like unbelievable. The women were dressed horribly. In the cities in Europe, normally, if you go out, you get dressed up. The women would wear these beautiful dresses or tailored suits with gloves, hats, and leather bags. Here, people were dressed so casually. For me, they were wearing schmutzes, rags. I was so homesick. I wanted so much to go back to Poland. What did I do? What did I do, and where do I find myself? I thought, if I had to spend my life like this, I'd rather kill myself. The most important thing for me at first was to learn English. My Nathan started working right away. I started taking courses in English. Now, the relationship between the immigrants and the Canadian Jews was very strange. The Jewish Congress did a lot for the immigrants. They helped financially. They had so many committees. They had Jewish Immigrant Aid Services. They had the Hebrew Free Loan Society. They had everything to help people in every aspect. In my personal situation, we didn't need any financial help. We had 3 people working: my husband, Nathan, my cousin, Nathan, and Misha, my brother-in-law. We all lived together and didn't need any help. Socially, however, there was zero help from the Jewish Canadians. This means there was completely no social integration, nothing. I understand we did come with a big package and we couldn't stop talking about what happened in Europe. It means whenever I used to go out with my friends, my immigrant friends, it didn't matter what we did or where we went. We always ended up talking about what we did during the war. I had a friend, we used to go to theater, and some were comedies. Afterwards, we would go out for coffee feeling very happy, sit down, talk, and we always ended up on the Holocaust. What happened to me, to her, she was in the camps. It cannot be any other way and couldn't be. It exists until now. Our lives came to a halt during the war, and we could not imagine people planning celebratory events like wedding anniversaries. I had a cousin on my mother's side living in the United States, and she was really very, very nice. She invited us to attend her 10th wedding anniversary. This was 1953. I could not believe that people could have a 10-year anniversary. How, in 1943, could life be normal? People could live without struggle. It was beyond anything I could think of. At that time, the Jewish Canadian community didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't nice. They didn't want to know. They had no interest. You know, I remember going to France. People talked about the war. People talked about the camps. People talked about what they lived through. And in Canada and the United States, you didn't talk about it. There was no integration. We had a group of friends, immigrants, most of them I met here, people usually with the same interest, people that were more secular. I was not religious whatsoever. We got together, we liked to talk or read a book at the Jewish Public Library. Some of us formed long friendships. With others, they were short. I had a huge group of people that we met together. We spent holidays together. Our kids know each other even until now, if there's anybody left. I didn't form any true friendships with Canadian Jews. When I think about it, I most probably didn't want to. Socially, I could not, nor could they. We lived parallel lives. Those first 10 years in Montreal were really tough. There was nothing here. I was never well suited for homemaking. I did not enjoy staying home, but there was nothing I could do. I was constantly frustrated. I couldn't go to work. There was no daycare whatsoever. You could not ask a friend to take care of your child in the same way you can ask your sister or your mother. Everyone was so overworked and so overwhelmed with no support. So what changed for me? Assimilation is a strange thing. It's a hard thing. It's a very gradual process. In the beginning, you hate it. I can't be like them. Then you start to mellow. You think, if I'm going to be like them, well, that's how it is. Then you accept it. I grew to love this place, and I felt that I belong. I also like the feeling that you love a country, but you do not need to die for this country, which is what I felt for Poland and even Israel, although I never lived there. There was a kind of freedom for me to not be so attached to a country, yet still love the place. I also started slowly to like what I hated in the beginning, the informality of everything, even the way I could dress. I remember going to visit Israel. When I came back from Israel, I said, for goodness sake, I like it here better than there. This is when I knew I was home.
Okay. So those are the 4 readings, and I would like to thank Malia and Judy and Robbie and Margot and Ami for doing such a great job. I would like to thank Hillary and the JCC for organizing this. I guess we're open to have any questions you might have.
That was fantastic. That really, it's so amazing to put a voice to what you read. So thank you everybody for sharing your time and doing those readings for us. Zelda, will you remind me, the book is based on conversations that you had with your mom, is that correct?
No.
Okay.
It started with a conversation I had with my mom just before she died. You know, it's funny, I'm a person who asks lots and lots of questions, and then one day, you know, I mean, 60 years later, I realized that I knew nothing about my parents' experience except what I had lived, right? So I was curious, and I said, well, who helped you? And that began that conversation where she said, no one, absolutely no one helped me. And then I didn't want the book to be about my mother. I wanted a larger story, right? A grander narrative of immigration, of displacement, of, you know, rebuilding lives.
So was there a turning point in Canada when Jews became more accepted? Was it the next generation that was actually born on Canadian soil? Was there a tipping point?
Well, we did ask the people we interviewed that question, and
we first thought it was about Paul Newman.
And the movie Exodus.
It's like,
right?
like that's where we started, and everybody said no, and they started to list books and just a shift, you know.
There was a shift. There was, you know, so it became more popular in literature. People began to write about it, right? And then there were movies. There were many movies. You know, Exodus of one. Elie Wiesel wrote. You know, he wrote a number of books. There was the Eichmann trial in Israel, and I think what happened for a lot of the survivors, they became citizens. And they were no longer fearful. It took a long time. So they began to act up, act out, right? And then the second generation, I guess my generation, right? We sort of, you know, began to talk out. And I think that's what began to shift. You know, that was, you know, so that began to shift. But you know, the question is, you know, not so much, you know, what changed, but what is interesting, why did it happen, right? Why did Canadian and American, I believe it's true also in the United States, why were they so hostile to the Jews coming? I think that was a more interesting question, and in Estelle and Irving's narrative, they begin to address it.
Well, I mean, here in the United States, we had, quotas. I mean, the government wouldn't let anyone come in. They turned full boatloads away of people and sent them back to their deaths. So not as versed in Canadian history as I am, understanding what went on here. Brenda said that her parents' situation was not at all like this in Montreal and St. Agatha, but very positive. So do you think that may have depended on whether or not there was family already here? The people that you talked to mostly were depending on social services, is that correct?
No, quite
No?
the opposite. Almost everyone didn't. They helped each other. There was no social service. There was minimum social service available. I think if you ask most people, if we go back to Henya, right? I think they said life was good. It was hard. I think we often confuse hard and good. Things could be hard, but they could also be good, right? They were rebuilding their lives. They started anew. They had new families. They had children. They developed community. All this is good, but there was a lot of hardship in so doing it, right? They were very poor at the initial, the first few years, like extremely poor. There was, and I think it's very, very true. You can't ask people to help you in the way you could ask a mother and a sister. And for a lot of people, that wasn't there. And everyone, as Teresa said, was so overworked, right? They were untethered.
Toby said the first reading mentioned a survivor from or near Vilna, and that her father was from that city, and he and others from there formed the Vilna Society. In your research, did you find that other survivors also formed similar support groups with others from their towns?
Yes, every small town had a society. So my mom was from small town Clovis, but there was a larger town, Częstochowa, they had that. That was the support groups they formed, right? So not only did the survivors stay with survivors, but they also stayed with their own communities, right? That, they met people from their towns. So there was this comfort at home.
How long did the research take? And then in turn, how long did the book take to write and edit?
We started in 2012, and we came for 3 months. We thought we could get all the work done. And at the end, we were just starting. We were just we had a number of the interviews, and we found we were living on the East Coast of
Nova
Canada.
Scotia.
And we found when we went back there, we couldn't do anything. Like we thought we would do some writing and research, but only when we would come back to Montreal, we would have the interviews. And even when we started to actually write the book in 2016, 17, we had to come back here to Montreal to do it. When you walk the streets here, it can feel like 1948. I mean, it's an old constructed urban area here where we are. And so that made it very easy, in a sense, easier for us to really get the atmosphere and to write and to reflect on stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we spent hours and hours in the archives reading old documents, reading old files, and we lived in the area, and we still do now, where the survivors settled. It was a very dense area. So we are in a triplex. Our flat is about 1,000 square feet. So there's about 3,000 square feet in the whole building. And on each flat, there was 2 families. So you could have 24 people living in 3,000 square feet. So just to get a sense of the density. But we would walk every day. We would walk the neighborhood, the area, we would feel it. And I was trying to, also at the time, teach John, so we watched Judy Kravitz, the movie. And then he was struggling with the notion of what is a Shtetl, so I made him watch Fiddler on the Roof.
The ultimate Shtetl, right?
Yeah, to see what a Shtetl was. But the actual, so it was 5 years of research because we had a lot of interviews, a lot of archival. And then in 2017, we came for 5 months. I had a sabbatical and the book was written in that 5-month period. I submitted it for publication. I heard back and they wanted a revision. I did another revision and we wrote. And then it was published in 2019. So once the writing was, once we decided on the structure of the book, it went very quickly.
Yeah, it seems that the research is the toughest part, right?
Right. Yeah.
How, Zelda, how do you think that your background being in academia and teaching sociology, how did that affect the interviewing process, your writing process?
Well, first of all, when we talk, my sociology background, I was more interested, as I said, in the grand narrative, right? The structure. So, the feminist approach to it, the whole notion of mother work, of, I looked at, integration and immigration, right? So all those, are sociological themes, which were very, very important for me to include, right? Of how, immigration happens, resistance to immigration, racism, anti-Semitism, that was all very, very important. And at the same time, it had to be relevant to people's lives today. So to any group of people crossing borders, any group of people who are refugees, what does it mean for them, right? These are the future people, so they'll be the future Americans, the future Canadians who have contributed greatly to people's lives. And, sometimes being a sociologist was a hindrance because I became obsessed with methodology and writing technical and wanting the book to appeal to academics and non-academics. So it became a bit of a frustration.
I have a psychology major in the works, and I can see how that might affect all the things she does for the rest of her life. So, and she likes to analyze me, so that I don't like so much.
Okay, you go, Jewish mother.
Yep. Sandy said that she loved hearing the readings and was wondering if there are plans to do an audio version of the book.
Well, Margot, I'm going to ask Margot to unmute. Margot has written the Montreal Shtetl she has scripted it into a play. Margot, do you want to talk about that, or you'll have to unmute?
I got it.
You got it.
Hi. Yes, I spent some months adapting it for the stage, and in close collaboration with Zelda and John, and it has a intrinsic theatricality, right? And we're waiting to hear from a body that we applied for a grant, and hopefully we'll go into production once the COVID lifts. But
that's awesome. So
yeah.
if you bring it to Chicago, you've got to let us know, because we would love to be able to.
But it's interesting because we, as we deal with the COVID circumstances, we're now thinking of going further in the adaptation to an audiobook or to a Zoom presentation, whatever. So all of that, it's all very exciting. But the material, as you can see, as you can hear, is so rich.
And it's amazing how you all brought the feeling and the true essence of what the interviewees must have felt, reliving their past, having to bring some of these things back up. We talked a little bit in your in your section about how, you know, you weren't sure about the immigrants and you know, they didn't like to talk about it. And we've seen, not only do I do this, but I help coordinate the JCC Chicago Jewish Film Festival. And we're seeing that second generation, third generation, more so than second, survivors are coming out with these unbelievable stories of what their grandparents survived, that their parents knew nothing about because their grandparents didn't talk about it. So the fact that you were able to get 67 interviewees to really go back to their past and tell you what happened to them is amazing. Absolutely amazing.
What actually we found was really interesting, when we set up the interviews, we told the people, you know, the survivors, that, you know, we'd like to interview them, but the focus of interview is life after the war, coming to Montreal, resettling. Because we knew there was a lot written about the Holocaust and there were a lot of stories documented, but we couldn't find much about, you know, the, you know, rebuilding of lives, the resettlement, the migration. So that was the crux of the book.
So we would show up at someone's house and start to film, and they would talk about their lives before the war. And of course, they would have to share what had gone on during the war. And then when we would ask, well, what happened after the war? They would have a few sentences and thought that the interview was over. And Zelda said, no, 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 this is where we're just starting. And we found out that most people hadn't talked about after the war. They really hadn't unpacked that. You know, that they came, they got a job, they got married, they had kids, whatever, you know, that was it. And so we found that they didn't want to stop the interviews. We'd be filming for 3-4 hours sometimes, you know, and it was the first time that they had talked seriously and reflected about after the war, their own experiences.
One of the unanticipated outcomes was some of the people we interviewed were the late 80s, 90s, some were infirmed. And to have someone come to your house for hours on a cold winter night, this became a gift, you know, a gift to them. And the other thing that was really interesting was, you know, I had left Montreal in 1971. It was a real long time ago. So I didn't have much of a community, nor did I know many people. I knew Judy and not many people else. So it was a bit challenging to, you know, get people to interview and to make connections. And, you know, I would always say that I was, you know, a daughter of Holocaust survivors. And they would ask me if I spoke Yiddish, and I said, yes, I spoke Yiddish. So while we set up the interview, John was going to work on the filming, and I had all those consent forms, the ethics that a university dictates. And while that was happening, I didn't even notice this. They were speaking to me in Yiddish only. And as soon as the interview began, they spoke English, mostly. And, you know, so John made that observation, and then he said, they were testing you. They were testing if they could trust you in the interview because they didn't know you. And that happened many, many times, over and over again.
So because you could speak and understand Yiddish, that was the,
Save the day.
that made all the difference.
Right.
It's a good thing you didn't ask me to do that, because we would be silent right now. I knew my grandparents and my grandmother spoke Yiddish when she didn't want all the grandchildren to know what she was saying to my mother and my aunt and my uncle. So, and my mom understands it, but doesn't speak it. So it's not trickled down to the rest of us, unfortunately. I'm just really thrilled that we were able to put this together and have you join us. And to all the readers, thank you so much. This has been super, super special and a really different way to experience stories of the Holocaust. You know, these stories of survival are just incredible, going to a place where, you know, you might not have known what to expect, but hope that it was better than what you were coming from. So thank you so much for writing the book. We're just thrilled to have had you. I did record this, and so if any of your friends missed it, it'll be posted on our JCC Chicago YouTube page in about a week or so. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please visit jccchicago.org. We've got many more conversations with authors. We have some film conversations coming up. We're going to tour the synagogues of Chicago. So lots of good things coming up. Wishing everyone continued good health. Take care of yourselves. And thank you again, Zelda and John. It was wonderful.
Okay,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
One.
you.